All right, guys, thank you for coming back to the Salem Center Causal Inference Seminar. We're very grateful to have Stefan Baker here from Stanford. He's going to talk about a very interesting project that he's been working on for the past year, couple of years, on treatment effects in market equilibrium. Thank you, Stefan.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks everyone for being here. So yeah, today I want to talk about running experiments and estimating treatment effects in a marketplace. Okay. I need to somehow figure out how to click through this box and find the mouse.
Oh, yeah, just click on the screen.
This is not working. Okay, I'll talk to you. So anyways, it feels a little funny talking about experimental design and randomized trials as an area, rapidly changing area, because after all, we've been running experiments for years, right, forever. If you want a new medicine, you want to get it approved, you have to go to the FDA. That's a randomized controlled trial. If you're running psych experiments, you're going to run a randomized controlled trial. So people have been running experiments for a very long time, but something has changed. And that's that the kind of resources required to collect data and run experiments have become cheap enough and widely available enough that now it's not just a handful of scientific applications where we're running experiments, but we're just running experiments everywhere, right? A bunch of companies, they're optimizing some minute decisions, they're going to run experiments. And this has led to new challenges. One of them is that we now often run experiments on just very large data sets, so you can kind of hope to estimate heterogeneity, find things that you couldn't find in smaller traditional, say, site studies. And another thing is that we're now running experiments in kind of very complicated settings, almost like miniature economies where everything is interconnected. And this really pushes us outside of the realm of kind of traditional treatment effect estimation theory. So just to get everyone on the same page, I'm going to illustrate this problem in the context of imagining a government running experiments on agricultural subsidies. Of course, governments aren't going to run experiments on agricultural subsidies. This isn't an experiment you could really run. But if you want to kind of think of this as realistic, think about a large tech company that essentially runs a complex system, and they're running experiments on something like this. I'll just talk about this because it's a context many of us are familiar with. So agricultural subsidies are widely used to support the farming sector. For example, let's say you have a lot of corn farmers. The government wants to support them. You might have this idea of giving them a subsidy of some number of dollars per unit produced. This is not that far from actually do here. It's very natural to ask things like, what is the effect of this subsidy on producer welfare? And if you were to design a randomized controlled trial, how would you do so in order to measure the effect of this subsidy? But this isn't quite trivial, right? You could imagine running a small study where you randomly subsidize some farmers and you don't subsidize anyone else. This is easy to do. You can compare how the subsidized versus unsubsidized people did in your study, and you might find that the subsidized people were very happy. And who wouldn't be, right? You're in a marketplace where you're getting subsidized to produce something that no one else is getting subsidized to produce, so you're going to make a lot of profits. But now, if you imagine deploying the subsidy to everyone, now you're in a different world, because suddenly everyone's getting subsidized. You're going to, at the marketplace level, increase production, and as demand goes up, this means that there's going to be an oversupply. Product prices are going to go down, and this is going to have a negative effect. So this is kind of an important effect, and it just is clear that predictions from the simple experiment that just compared people who received or didn't receive a subsidy in this small experiment was too optimistic about the total effect of the subsidy on producer welfare. So to be clear, I'm not saying that this randomized trial is useless here. I'm just saying that something is going on here beyond the standard sativa-based trial that we have a bunch of theory for, and kind of work is needed to understand what is going on. So that's essentially the goal of this talk. The goal is to understand what happens in experiments that you run in a marketplace setting. The first goal is just to kind of get our bearings. You run a randomized trial, what happens? What does the randomized trial estimate? How can you interpret it? And the second goal is to then, kind of once we get a handle on this, to actually think about how can you design randomized controlled trials in a marketplace setting to answer policy questions of interest. Throughout, I'm going to talk about this kind of what's going on in a marketplace as a form of interference. So this is kind of in causal inference, very generally, we talk about interference, where kind of the treatment I get might affect your outcomes and vice versa. Interference comes up in many different settings, right? Like if you're in a vaccine trial, one person getting vaccinated can affect outcomes for others. If you're in a kind of voting, kind of political persuasion setting, if you convince one person to vote for a certain candidate, that might also affect their neighbors. This is all interference. These are very different problems. The types of interference that come up in these different settings might call for different methods. And here I'm going to try to study marketplace effects as a specific type of interference. Any questions at this point? Cool. All right, so before we're talking about interference, here's the one mandatory slides on randomized trials without interference, just to get on the same page with that implementation. Randomized trials, of course, go back to work by Neyman. The standard model is that you assume that each unit in your study has two potential outcomes, yi0, yi1, corresponding to what would have happened to them with or without treatment. In a randomized controlled trial, you're going to randomly assign treatment that's derived from the Bernoulli. The observed outcome is the potential outcome corresponding to the treatment. And then what are we trying to do? Our question is, what is the average treatment effect? The average difference between the treated and controlled potential outcomes, the sample average treatment effect here. And the kind of first result of inference is that if in this setting, if you take the average outcome for treated units minus the average outcome for controls, this is unbiased with the average treatment effect based on randomization. Amazing result in kind of its generality and robustness, but where can we poke at it? We're going to poke at it here. This whole framework started from positing two potential outcomes. What would have happened to you with treatment versus without treatment? It's very clever. This notation kind of rules out interference. It rules out marketplace effects. There's no room in here for reasoning about how, like, my treatment would affect someone else. And if we want to talk about this, we're not going to need to break out this notation. Now, in a general potential outcomes model, there aren't just two potential outcomes for each person. In principle, my outcome could depend on everyone's treatment in the room. So if there are n people in your study, there are 2 to the n potential outcomes corresponding to every possible treatment vector. And then you observe the outcome for the ith person indexed by the full treatment vector. This is a much more general setting. It's a much more complicated. And now to make any progress here, we're going to need to fix our ideas. We're going to need to decide again, what's the question we're asking? And what structure can we impose on the problem to make any progress? So again, here, the goal is going to be to do treatment effect estimation in a marketplace setting. So I'm going to try to get as quickly as possible back to the marketplace setting where you have prices, supply, demand, all that stuff. But first, I'll need a couple slides on just basics about what are targets, what's the general framework for talking about restrictions. So first, I'm going to go very quickly here and revisit this at the end of the talk. So these are the questions I'm going to be interested in this talk. I'm going to want to estimate the average direct and indirect effect of a treatment. The average direct effect is just asking, on average, among people in the trial, if I toggle your own treatment, I said, push you from 0 to 1, then marginalizing over what everyone else gets, how does that toggling your own treatment affect? I should note this expectation here is only over the treatment. These yi's are held fixed, like in the potential outcome. If there's no interference, the average direct effect is just average direct. Then the other question I'm going to ask is, what is the average indirect effect? This is a weirder notion, but it's essentially just the mirror image of this definition. This is just asking for the ith person, like what is the typical effect of toggling the ith person's treatment on all other jth outcomes while again marginalizing over other people's treatments? It's a slightly more unusual definition. For now, I'll just write it down and note that it's just the complement of this definition, and that if there's no interference, the average indirect effect is 0. At the end of the talk, I'll argue kind of more quantitatively that essentially the sum of the average direct and indirect effects in some sense captures the total effect of a policy. For example, in the marketplace model, the average direct effect will essentially capture the direct effect, and the average indirect effect will capture the effect of the policy via prices. Okay, so these are our questions, and now we need to impose some structure on the problem too. And here, the standard way to do so is using an exposure mapping. An exposure mapping is for the ith person. It's some function that kind of takes the full vector of treatments and summarizes it in a way that captures all the relevant information. For example, one kind of standard example of this is the paper from Pascal and Toulis, where they looked at an intervention to improve school attendance, and they assumed that, okay, there are n people in the study, in principle you care about everyone's treatment, but actually you just care about your own treatment, your siblings' treatment assignment, and once you fix those, nothing else matters. That's a typical exposure. Now, of course, in the pricing setting, it looks qualitatively very different from this, right? In a pricing setting, I don't care if like one of you produces a good or someone else. It's like all I care about is how many goods are produced in aggregate and how this affects supply and demand. But you can still approach this via the exposure mapping framework. Essentially, here, what we're going to assume is that we're in a marketplace. Goods are bought and sold at a given price, and this price mediates all interference effects. So as an exposure mapping, what I'm going to say is that for kind of a treatment vector assigned to everyone, for the ith person, if two different treatment vectors give me the same treatment and yield the same prices, market equivalent prices, then outcomes are going to be the same. So kind of with that use of notation, you can say that actually potential outcomes only depend on your treatment assignment and market prices, and I'm going to use this notation. So maybe as a picture of what's the kind of study setting where there's no interference. It's just here in the bipartite graph. This is the treatment given to the n study participants. These are the n outcomes, and only the treatment given to the ith person affects the easy. A general model for interference is that now all treatments can affect all outcomes, and it's a mess. The standard way of doing exposure mappings is to essentially prune this graph until this has a sparse enough set of edges you can handle it. Here we're doing something different. We're essentially creating this new node. This is a vector of prices for J goods traded in our economy. Treatments can affect the price. Prices can affect outcomes, but beyond that, there are no diagonal edges.
So there are only two potential prices that someone could face, though, right? It's like the market level price or the subsidized price.
That's a great question. So here we're going to assume, I'm going to go into more details in just a second, that there are J goods. Like it could be in a farming example. If you're raising goats, it could be the price of hay and the price of meat. So two goods you care about, one because you have to purchase it to feed the goats, other to sell it. And these could float free, right? So these could float free. So at a given moment, there will only exist two prices. Like, no, there only ever exists one price level in the market. Kind of the free market price for hay, the free market price for goats. And these float by matching supply and demand. So if suddenly people decide to start farming more goats, the price of goats is probably going to go down. Then the subsidy is doing something else. The subsidy is an intervention, so that kind of some people in market equilibrium will be in a more favorable condition than others. Where some people are kind of buying and selling in this market, And kind of behind the scenes, they're getting the subsidy, which puts them in a good position. But that isn't reflected on the market. On the market level, they're just for each good, there's a unique price.
So the prices here are across multiple goods, but so the Ys are welfare of the producers of one good. Is that what you're looking at?
They're end people. So there's a very large number of farmers.
Every person produce only one thing.
You could produce many things. That's, yeah.
What do you measure in Y?
So, okay. Maybe I'll skip ahead.
Yeah.
Where do prices come from? Price match by supply and demand, so I'll describe it now. Okay. So what we're going to assume is that there are a large number of, say, farmers. And the farmers can produce many goods. They could grow corn, they could grow wheat, they could farm cattle, right? But there's like a finite number of goods they could produce. And then there's going to be a price for all these goods you could produce. And what we assume is that prices form such as to match supply and demand. With these supply and demand functions, you can think of them generally as like the things you have in Econ 101, right? Like how much are you going to produce of a good? Like prices go up, you produce more. How much are you going to consume of a good? Prices go up, you consume less. These good lines are going to cross at some point. That's going to form prices. If we actually want to make sense of this curve, it's a little delicate. But this paper by Indirect and Inference does it very nicely. Essentially, what they just look at is your like supply and demand curves as essentially potential outcomes. So this SWP could just tells you if I gave you this subsidy and market prices were that, how would you behave? And so then prices arise by solving this equilibrium condition written in terms of potential supply and demand. And some more assumptions are needed. For example, for existence and uniqueness of prices, this is standard econ. And econ 101, they call this a well-present general equilibrium model with agents. But anyways, this is a well-studied object. We're going to assume that prices. And so we haven't done much at this point, but we have now specified what our estimates are. So what's the average direct effect? It's the effect of kind of you getting the treatment versus not getting treatment. There's also a little effect where kind of prices changed, maybe from you getting treated versus not getting treated. What's the average indirect effect? This only depends on prices. So you got the treatment you were going to get, but someone else got treated versus didn't get treated. This affected prices. And we want to understand how this kind of leads into outcomes. Sorry, one thing I didn't really emphasize, but again, here I'm assuming that kind of if they're J goods, there are kind of 2J plus 1 potential outcome functions for everyone. Meaning how you would produce the J goods, how would you consume the J goods, and the outcome, which I'm letting you flex. You could have the outcome could be some deterministic function of other stuff, like it could be your profit, or it could be something that isn't deterministically tied to other problem parameters. Here I'm leaving. Yeah.
Just confirm that function P in our first equation, it actually depends on the unit system, not just the algorithm. Carbon both the W and the time, but it also depends on this particular unit.
Yeah, so the P always depends on everyone's treatment.
Okay.
So it's just like there's one price in the market, and it depends on subsidies or other incentives everyone got.
To be clear, we're still in, like, W is still randomly assigned. The expectation is with respect to that.
Yes.
Okay.
That's good. So there is this kind of fancy footwork here. This is at the end, I'll talk about how this connects to like very concretely interpretable policy effects in more detail. But for now, you can think of these estimates as a local to the study we're running. So we're running a study. It's randomizing treatment, and kind of given this treatment assignment mechanism, what is the typical marginal effect of toggling your treatment on yourself or toggling your treatment on others. These are some and interpreted.
Actually, sorry, can you go back? For your average indirect effect.
Yeah.
Can you go back to the statement I'm on, please? I'm missing my. Okay, so this one, and then the next statement of it you just had, I think that there just might have been a. Keep going. I want to make sure I understand something, then I do have a question. Here we go. So that little lowercase wj, the right on the right node should be wi. Is that right?
Thank you. This should be W.
Right. It's okay. So, but my question here is: so this average indirect effect is saying, for the ith unit, I'm going to fix the treatment to.
Yeah.
No, am I getting this wrong again? For the average indirect effect, the ith unit's treatment changes, and want to know the effect on all the other j units, which is not usually how indirect effects are. Aren't the indirect effects usually saying, I want to hold the ith unit's treatment constant and see what happens when I change the treatments of the other j units? And it's not necessarily symmetric.
This one you could look at it both ways, right? So this is a double sum over I and j for I not equal to 2. So I could take it in both ways.
So because there's one type of units,
Yeah.
and it is the same.
Yeah, but the reason I wrote it in this direction, I agree. Typically, I also typically think about the indirect effects the other way. It's like, what is the effect of everyone else toggling their treatments
Yes,
on
right.
me as opposed to vice versa? But it turns out when you want to understand the statistics of this problem, this is the right way. Like, because that's where the randomness is coming. My treatment is randomized, that's the random outcome, and then I want to understand how it affects outcomes for everyone else and for me. These are the two consequences of my treatment. I'm sorry about that.
No, it's okay. The answer
It's confusing enough as it is. All right. So anyways, but yeah, I think like this conversation highlights, this is a subtle estimate that's tricky to think about. So what's going on? Can we kind of interpret this? So far I've tried to be kind of strict in the potential outcomes world. I've only written down potential outcomes. The treatment is random. I'm trying to work with that. But to make progress, what I'm going to assume is an IID sample. So people can be different. A person is characterized by their outcome demand and supply potential outcomes, but I'm assuming the types are drawn from a distribution. I'm going to write mu, d, and s for the average potential outcomes for y, d, and s respectively. And in this setting, nice things happen. First, you can take n goes to infinity, things converge in probability to a limit. So we can reason in terms of that limit. That's reassuring. First, prices converge to a large sample limit. The large sample limit of prices matches the expected supply and demand. So this is kind of reassuring. Things don't diverge as n goes to infinity. So we have a well-defined asymptotic estimate. Second, and more interestingly, for us, the average direct and indirect effects also converge in probability to some limits in the system. And these turn out to be much easier to interpret than these kind of big expression in terms of potential outcomes. So if we zoom in, first, what's the average direct effect? It's saying this is the average potential outcome you get if, remember, this mu depends on your treatment and on equilibrium prices. So the average direct effect is just saying, suppose we exogenously set market prices to the large sample on average market price, and I toggle your treatment from 0 to 1, what would be the effect on average? That's the average direct effect. It essentially has a mean field interpretation. It's saying that in large samples, the average direct effect really just is the effect of the treatment on you, where you kind of average out everyone else. So far, so good. And what about the average indirect effect? What this is going to converge to is the following one. It first looks at how does changing treatment probability change market clearing prices, and then it looks at, on average, how do people respond to changes in prices. So here, remember, mu1 P, that's the typical treated response at prices P. Mu 0 P is a typical control response. We're treating people with probability pi. So this is just a kind of marginalizing overtreatment assignment, your typical response at prices P. So this first part here is measuring how, on average, you respond to changing prices, and this measures how prices respond to changing treatment fraction. So again, this has mean field type interpretation. You're playing against people's average behavior, not against any specific person's behavior. And this is kind of reassuring. You recover price elasticities. Like, of course, any economist working on this problem will explain it to you in terms of price elasticity. So that's kind of reassuring. Any questions at this point? You might actually, if you talk to an economist, they might just write this down to start. They wouldn't write calculation. Okay. So we're trying to study randomized trials in a potential outcome type specification in a marketplace design. We've answered two questions so far. How can we think about prices and what are kind of average direct and indirect type estimates here? They're kind of familiar if we look at the econ literature on this. And now we can really get to the estimation part. How can we design experiments to estimate, to identify the ADE and the AIE? How can we build confidence intervals for these things? And how can we relate these estimates to total policy effects of interest that we might care for optimizing the system? Any questions? All right. So first, for estimation, turns out one thing is easy. Estimating the average direct effect is nice. Remember we talked before about this randomized trial where you just kind of, you forgot about interference, you naively looked at the average outcome for treated people, the average outcome for controls, you looked at the difference. We talked about how this is not going to be the average treatment effect under interference, and this seemed concerning, but it turns out we land on our feet. This is still something interesting. It's the average direct effect, as you know. The fact that this thing is consistent with average direct effect is something that if you stared at this literature for a while, you should expect. There's this very nice paper by Peter Arnold, that consider a network interference model, and they argue that very generally this thing is consistent with ADE. Here we're not in a network interference model, so it's a different result, but substantively it's very well. Another thing we get here that's nice, that is not always true. For example, it's not true in their network interference model, they don't show it, is we get a central limit. So this difference in means is going to converge to the average direct effect at a read and write, and it's going to have a normal sample distribution. So showing this, it might seem like this is just amazing, right? Like you just study your RCT ignoring interference and everything is worked. But it's not quite true. You get this variance parameter in the CLT that you need to get right in order to build confidence intervals. And this thing is actually going to depend on interference. This thing is going to depend both on kind of how you respond directly to treatment and on how kind of treatment effects go through prices. Both are going to have kind of first order effects on this. So if you want to get valid confidence intervals, you need to do a lot more work. In the paper we discuss it. We show how to estimate this.
I lost track of my declarations on tau. Is tau star the probability limit, or is that the potential outcomes thing?
Great question. That's the larger limit. So yeah, tau ADE is a thing we define in the potential.
Yeah. So the root n rate is accounting for how long it takes to get the probability limit too.
Yeah. So kind of in kind of the normal set of the language, tau ADE would correspond to the sample average treatment effect, and tau star ADE would be the population. And so this captures.
This relies pretty heavily on agents being atomistic, right? In the sense that they're sort of not worrying about, market, distortions of their, this is only in the competitive equilibrium setting.
Oh yeah, that's a great point. And yeah, this is kind of goes back to just like interference. It's just like different types of problems, kind of vaccine, kind of political persuasion, marketplace settings, different interference mechanism leads to different phenomena and require different methods. So here we're really in the large market setting. we push n to infinity, everyone has a very small effect on the market. No one has market power, and then you get this kind of mean field. If you had any players who had legitimate market power, then it would. Thanks. All right. So that's for the direct effect. Then there's the indirect. And remember, this kind of depends on the average price elasticity and how treatment probability affects prices. And this is tricky. I conjecture that this might actually not even be estimable from the original RCT, where you only randomize treatment. So what we do in the paper is we actually propose using an augmented experiment to get a handle on this. What we're going to do is add a little bit of extra noise. So now instead of running a randomized trial where some people just get the subsidy and some people don't get the subsidy, we also add small perturbations, exogenous perturbations to prices, and we make it so that the ith person isn't actually exposed directly to market prices P. They're exposed to market prices P plus the small perturbation Zi. So now your realized outcome is Yi, the potential outcome index by your treatment, and market clearing prices towards Zi, and kind of P arises by clearing the market. These are going to be small perturbations, so they hopefully shouldn't really affect any person's experience to order one, but they're going to be.
Don't that, so you're assuming constant elasticity here also, right?
No. Everyone has different elasticities, but I care about that average elasticity.
Okay.
So, yeah, that's a great question. So the model is fully heterogeneous in people's types and how people respond to prices. But kind of the first mean field characterization result showed that under this fully heterogeneous model, the average indirect effect depends on the average elasticity.
So the reason for this random perturbation is because the only way you change P is through changing the W's without it. So you can't have, in some sense, like independent variability of something without the random perturbation?
Yeah, qualitatively, that's how I feel. Again, full disclosure, we don't have a theorem showing.
Yeah, there's only one thing you change here, is W, right? And
yeah.
that dictates exactly what P.
Exactly. So here we're kind of having another way to kind of, essentially the hope is that this, looking at how outcomes are affected by these price perturbations is going to give you a handle on the price axis. That otherwise we don't know. So it might look weird, but this thing is actually, it's again, should be familiar from the econ literature on this. Typically, in the econ literature, you estimate elasticities using instrumental variables that shift the supply and demand curves. So you could think of this price perturbation as like a manually created instrument. Something we're interested in, kind of, we don't do in this paper, but would be interesting for the future, is to kind of actually do this in an observational study setting where you have to rely on typical instruments. And this earlier paper with Guangzhou also talked about this paper, where we studied this in a different context, we call it global experiments. And finally, in terms of implementation, you might think this is a huge hurdle, but actually say if the person running the experiment controls the marketplace and imposes transaction fees, if they say randomized transaction fees, you get something like this. There are many other ways to get this. I just wanted to have one example to highlight that this is crazy. All right, so we're gonna.
Let me just wrap my head around this a second. You're trying to understand the effect of an intervention in market, some sort of treatment.
Yeah.
Right. And what you're trying to basically take into account the fact that any intervention in market is going to lead to price to be modified by supply and demand. But if you knew the elasticities or the average elasticity of the market ahead of time, then you wouldn't have to worry about your results basically showing me that then you know the indirect effect. If you knew the elasticity, right? So is basically you're telling me that, well, in the process of trying to measure the treatment effect here, I'm going to try to learn about elasticities as well.
That's right.
So is there any advantage of doing this together versus in two-stage, for example?
Yeah, so here we're just trying to give you a full recipe for estimating the direct and indirect effects and using an experiment. But in the paper, we actually have one example where we studied returns to education, where you might think that kind of if you encourage more students to study a topic, then there's more people who can work in that topic and wages go down. So you also have these direct and indirect effects. And there, instead of running an experiment, we just grab estimates of the literature, which is kind of people's wage elasticities and so forth. And then we use that to kind of, and they're also kind of, we reinterpret a number of people have published RCTs on kind of the effects of different types of interventions on kind of student participation in different majors, and then we just change together all these numbers and say, like, well, you should interpret this RCT result as the direct effect, here maybe the indirect effect, and here's something else. Yeah, that's a great picture. Here I'm just trying to give a recipe that you can use if you're able to run an experiment. And yeah, so kind of once we spike in these price perturbations, the way we're going to do this, first we're going to regress outcomes on these price perturbations. This estimator should be very familiar. It's essentially two-stage least squares where we're treating Z as an instrument. This is going to converge to the average price elasticity, and actually thinking of this as two-stage least squares is also helpful, and thinking about like what the, sorry, no, this is just a regression. Sorry. The final estimator is going to be two stages. So this is going to help get us this thing. Finally, second, we have this how do prices change with respect to treatment probability. Here we need to represent this using the implicit function theorem. V is this thing, it's a kind of average supply-demand mismatch. We want the derivative of V with respect to both P and pi. Then we notice that this first thing, d pi of V, is just the direct effect of treatment on supply minus demand. So we can estimate this like a direct effect, that is by the difference in means. And then we notice that this dP of V is going to be the average effect of that, the average elasticity of supply minus demand. So we estimated like an average elasticity, running the regression from before. And then what we're going to do is we're going to plug all these things together. And this is going to give us an estimate of the average indirect effect that we show is asymptotic. It no longer converges to the Rubin rate, it converges to the rate that depends on the scale of the perturbations. And yeah, I misspoke again. What looks like two stages squares is this final estimate. And you missed the message. Good. All right, so I think at this point, I owe you an example. This is a simple example, but it kind of illustrates how these things go together. So it's again motivated by agricultural subsidies. So let's say each unit could consume or produce more, and they have value and cost for doing so. Every person's type is governed by their value and cost. So these have some distribution. And we don't need this, but we're going to assume that everyone either is only a producer or only a consumer. Only one of B or C is non-trivial for each person. So this is actually a two-sided market. Each unit can consume or produce 0 or 1 units. And the treatment is a production subsidy that lowers cost of production by A. So what's going to happen? What we're going to assume is that suppliers supply if and only if their costs are lower than what they can get on the market. So if market prices were P, I would supply 1 unit of corn. If my costs are less than P, plus potentially if I receive the subsidy, then I look at whether C is less than P plus stuff. On the other hand, when you buy, well, you have some value, there's a market price, you buy if the value is bigger than the market price. It's very simple. Prices are going to rise to match supply and demand, right? And you see, when you raise prices, supply is going to go up If more and more people are going to want to produce, demand is going to go down, and there's obviously going to be a unique value P for which kind of you get close to matching supply. And our outcome here is going to be seller profit. That is just, if you're a seller, our prices plus the subsidy you receive minus your cost, other part of that. This is what you earned if you chose to supply something, and that's going to be our outcome. And now, in this model, you can run a randomized trial where you give the people a subsidy or not. You can estimate the direct effect by kind of looking at, for sellers, what was their outcome with the subsidy or not, and what do we get? So this red curve here is the distribution of the average direct effect. So here you get something like 0.8 on average. The distribution of the average direct effect estimates, something like 0.8 on average. So this looks like a really good subsidy. But then, I'm going to argue more in a second, more formally soon. Actually, you should think of the sum of the average direct effect and of the average indirect effect as a meaningful measure of the total policy effect of the policy. And then when you take the sum of the average direct and indirect effects estimated as discussed, you get this blue curve, concentrated more at like 0.35. So here you see that kind of the average indirect effect is negative. If you subsidize producers, market price goes down, this hurts producers, and it eats up more than half of the direct effect of the subsidy. So here you really want to take this into account to capture the total. The green curve here is the true total effect that we hope to target. So this is very short. In the paper, we have a bunch of tables with confidence intervals and other simulation examples that are more complicated, like different types of Roy models where people can choose what to buy and sell based on market price. Any questions about this?
So here we are assuming that the indirect effect or measuring indirect effect in terms of price changes, what we call unintended consequences of a policy. Can that have an indirect effect in terms of something other than price, like behavioral changes or something of that sort?
That's a great question. Yeah, so here kind of, again, it's like, if you want to make assumptions, it's good to hide them in the notations, so you're calling me out of them anyways. Early on, I assumed an exposure method. There's treatment, there's prices. My outcome only depends on my treatment and market prices. So this notation rules out any other indirect effects. But yes, there are other types of interference that could come up with this problem. One very typical one that comes up, you could imagine, say, in ride-sharing context, is congestion. Right? Like there's too much traffic. This is different from prices, but it feels a lot like prices. It's a shared state variable that kind of affects goals. In this paper, we only did prices, and we worked through prices, but yeah, extending to those kinds of settings would be good.
If the number of chip units are like that, are you using a completely randomized trial to get the number of chips, or like how do you confirm your randomized?
We use Bernoulli units.
Okay.
When you do interference, people often do completely randomized trials, and these are nice for many reasons. But in interference, completely randomized trials can give you headaches.
Because of the variance estimation?
No, because of like, in a completely randomized trial, if I tell you I am treated, this actually reduces your probability of being treated.
Yes.
And if you're not careful, this is going to be like an order 1 term in the indirect effect. Like, weird stuff can happen. You either end up with weird definitions, or you end up with definitions that require evaluating potential outcomes that are out of the support of what could conceptually come out of it. So, yeah. If you're doing kind of treatment spec estimation on a graph where your outcome only depends on outcomes treatment for a small number of neighbors, it's not that bad, because essentially everyone else's treatment assignment doesn't matter, and that kind of stuff washes out. But in a setting like this, where everyone's connected, that's actually an order 1 thing, and things get weird if you get outside of the
Yeah, and do you expect not every indirect effect to be negative before you conduct it? Before this connection?
I mean, certainly we thought it was going to be negative when we designed the simulation, but there's nowhere constrained that it has to be. I think in these subsetting things, typically, you're doing something that you think is going to help an outcome you care about. So the direct effect is going to be positive because it's doing the thing you wanted, and the indirect effect is going to be negative because it captures the externalities of like some people getting the outcomes you wanted may impose a cost on others. If the but sometimes the direct and indirect effects could both be in the same direction, like in vaccine trials, right? Both the direct and indirect effect of a vaccine are protection against the disease, and in that setting, yeah. Any other questions about this experiment? So I'm fine. I'm totally fine. Right?
Yeah.
I'm self-timed to 1 hour, so
Okay, yeah,
actually, do I typically go for an hour, or did I saw it's an hour and a half?
Go up to 90 minutes, so.
I'll keep talking and then I'll stop talking once. Okay, so there. So far, I've talked about the average direct and indirect effect. That are the average direct effect is like the ATE, but under interference. The average indirect effect is like the mirror image, but the captures the effect on others. And I talked about designing experiments to estimate these things. You can also get confidence intervals. But of course, in many cases, what you actually care about is a total policy, right? You change subsidies for everyone. And you might think that these average direct and indirect effects, like sure, they're interesting for scientists studying these things, but maybe policymakers care about them. So with the connection between these estimates and policy effects, and the claim is that the sum of the average direct and indirect effect is, in many settings of interest, a relevant policy. So the last thing I wanted to do today is work through one specific example. It's going to require a little more notation, but just kind of work through how the sum of these two is something for policy. And now suppose that instead of, so far we've always been in a binary setting, like subsidize, don't subsidize, treat, don't treat. But suppose that instead of a binary intervention, you had a continuous action. You wanted to measure the effect of a tax on a continuous outcome one. It could be like, let's say you're Amazon and you want to optimize how much you charge for Amazon Prime, right? This is another thing that is going to have a lot of direct and indirect effects that you want to change. So you want to optimize a continuous action given for everyone. You can study this using our setting. It's essentially the same thing. You have the same exposure mapping. You care about taxes. You care about your tax rate. You care about market level prices that depend on everyone's price for taxes. If there are two tax schedules that yield same taxes for you and same market prices, then you're indifferent between them. And then we're going to define a value function v of t, which would be the expected outcome if everyone were to be exposed to tax rate. A good tax rate would be t that maximizes the value. And here's how you can, everything we've talked about so far connects to optimizing tax. Let's say in this continuous action space, you embed a binary experiment. Some people get a baseline tax level T0, and some people get randomly higher taxes T0 plus 2, where you randomize who gets higher taxes or lower taxes. Again, this is a thought experiment using familiar language. The government is not going to run RCTs on taxes, but
Good.
I feel like there's a lot of lower hanging fruit. But you can imagine, right, a lot of these big organizations that control something like a tax rate. And then the theorem is that okay, here now it's a binary experiment because everyone is just getting like high tax, low tax. So you can estimate the average direct and indirect effect of this high-low tax experiment. The theorem is that in this experiment, in the high-low experiment, as you take delta to 0, and we normalize by delta, the sum of the average direct and indirect effect converges to d-value d-tax. So if you have a small high-low experiment, you estimate the average direct and indirect effect of the high-low experiment, then it gives you the derivative of welfare with respect to tax rate. Now this is the thing, there are a lot of papers in economics where people care about this kind of thing. So what are the implications? The first is just, there are econ papers where people care about estimating the welfare tax. Like a lot of, say, Roger Chetty's sufficient statistics based work targets this kind of model. Typically, the way you estimate these things is by comparing markets, looking at markets with slightly higher tax rates, slightly lower tax rates, and looking at the association of cross-market comparison of welfare. And the implication number one is if you cared about things like V prime T, then, and you're able to run experiments, then you can actually estimate them using unit level experiments like proposed. So again, you need to be able to randomize taxes given to people, but you can randomize them by a very small amount, so hopefully that doesn't disturb the market too much. They're relatively cheap and relatively unobtrusive experiments to run. And the huge benefit is that they're unit level experiments. So again, if you need to compare markets, so for example, different cities have different taxes and you need to compare across cities, there's not only so many cities you can compare, so you're stuck with a small samples. If you can run unit level experiments, you can have very small tax changes, but you have a huge sample size and still be well powered. So this is implication number one. You can estimate V prime T using tractable, unobtrusive unit level. Implication number two is that now that we can get V prime T, maybe not wearing an economist hat, but more of an engineer hat, we could say we have gradients, and we could actually now try to optimize the tax. Not just kind of write a letter to a policymaker saying, like, we think taxes are too high or too low relative to optimal welfare. But we could actually try to iteratively update taxes by gradient descent. So you give a machine learning person gradients, what are they going to do? Gradients. So here, what you could imagine is just running an algorithm where every time step you consider a high-low tax experiment. You compute the AD and AIE, you sum them, this gives you an estimate of the gradient of D welfare D tax, and then you update the system by gradient descent. And yeah, you could try to optimize the system this way. Is this any good? So here, the baseline, so here I'm going to go very quickly. We essentially have another paper where we talk about this, so if you want examples, I'll refer you to that. But the baseline is you could imagine any zeroth order learner that instead of kind of running these fancy unit level experiments to get gradients, it just kind of every day thinks it's a fresh market. And like today I'm going to try 15% tax, and tomorrow I'm going to try 25% taxes. And you just kind of try a different tax level every day until you find something good. So this could be the baseline. You just learn zeroth order optimization. You take marketplace level actions every day, observe the welfare. So how does this work? Well, what we prove is that our method, kind of under strong convexity results, and again, with formal results, this paper will come to, we have where there's a lot of machinery that I'm not going to go over now. But what we show is that if we have k time periods, we essentially get a 1/k rate of convergence. So a parametric type rate of convergence under strong convexity. This is just because we get gradients, and this is kind of a good rate of convergence you can get out of kind of well-designed gradient-based methods. On the other hand, The zeroth order baseline, that is the thing that kind of tries different things at each time point, cannot achieve a rate of convergence that's better than essentially corresponding to a 1 over root k instead of 1 over k at a rate of convergence. So kind of a slow rate as opposed to a fast rate. And this impossibility of doing well using the zeroth order baseline follows from fundamental arguments results on zeroth order. So essentially, now we're very far from what I started the talk with, that is understanding RCTs in a marketplace. But the point is that if you're kind of in some kind of take an engineering mindset, you have a continuous decision variable, you want to optimize it, you can run experiments. You could have simply just tried different tax levels every time period until you converge. If you do this, there are well understood impossibility results that mean that you can't beat a slow rate of 1 over root k, or you could go really indirect route of estimating direct and indirect effects using unit level randomized experiments, and you get 1 over k rate of convergence. That's the best. This paper has formal statements, but just to argue that this isn't nonsense. So here we consider a simulation where there are 200 epochs, and you're trying to optimize a tax, and there are two things you might care about. A first thing you might care about is how well did you do in step. So this is your in-sample regret. How much loss did you get during these 200 time periods relative to the best thing you could have done? And the second question you might ask is, what is the future expected regret after these 200 time periods? You pick an action that you're going to deploy from here on out. What's the loss you get there relative to the best thing you could have done? So these dots in red are different zeroth order baselines, different baselines that kind of try different tax rates on different days and try to learn from that. The reason there are many of them is that they're tuning parameters here. I have no idea how to pick these tuning parameters, so I just traced out the surface. And here's the loss we get from our method. It's not zero. It just looks like zero relative to the so this kind of shows that if you're able to get gradients by this local experimentation idea, you just are much, much more. You might think that this picture is kind of drastic, but then on the other hand, that's what the theory also suggests, right? Slow rates versus fast rates, but 200 time periods, right? That suggests the square root 200 separation factor, which is well in line with this picture. And of course, getting to here is not free, right? This is just purely black boxy. You try stuff, you don't have to think too hard. Just try stuff, you optimize from there. This thing requires kind of modeling the marketplace, reasoning about equilibria. Yeah, so a lot of assumptions that work goes into this. This is something you get out of the box. And here you see one sample path where this proposed method. Any questions about this? All right, so that's essentially that's what I had today. So we talked about randomized trials and treatment effect estimation under marketplace equilibrium. We started off with something that looked a lot like just RCT interference work, but in a marketplace setting. We talked about how potential outcomes exposure mappings look in this setting. And then when you push to a large sample limit, you find a mean field limit. This helps us understand what's going on with the direct and indirect effects are. We talked about how to estimate the confidence intervals for them. And then once you have these estimates, you can do a list like optimists. So that's one thing. And yeah, kind of what does this mean more broadly? I think today I've talked about one model, right, where prices equilibrate markets. The way I see this is it's a special case of kind of trying to study randomized trials and treatment effect estimation in kind of complex systems that come up when you're trying to run experiments in a setting where everyone is interacting with each other. and trying to combine theory from economics, social sciences on what happens in these systems with kind of best practices from causal inference on trying to be as non-parametric as possible and see what you can get. So here we had this kind of supply-demand matching as kind of what we intended to be a minimal assumption from economics that helped us capture marketplace effects, and then kind of we tried to push forward from the generic model to get at direct and indirect effects. But I mean, the questions are, what are other models from economics that enable you to do something similar? What do estimate and guarantees look like there? I think there are a lot of interesting questions there. That's all I have today. Questions.
Is continuous propensity score involved in activating a PX? Is continuous propensity score involved in activating a PX variance? Or is that is PX a dependent function, or the PX?
What do you mean by yes?
The exposure method?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. The yeah.
Yeah. Is propensity score involved in that, or so?
That's a great question. So everything here is in the RCT set. So there are no propensity scores.
Okay.
Everyone is tree recovered. So doing this in an observational study setting, where maybe you want to adjust for different propensity scores, or maybe even more, you want to use instruments to kind of to shift supply and demand curves. That would be super interesting. I think for now we just had enough headaches between like establishing the mean field limits, and there's enough stuff going on just in this baseline specification, so we haven't looked at that yet. But that would be a very natural direction to go.
What about like cluster randomization, block randomization? Does that sort of work how you'd expect it to, or?
Yeah, it should. So I skipped entirely these confidence intervals stuff because I think there were enough technical details in here already. But the way you can think of these results. So first, for the direct effect, you can really think of like my being treated. It affects me in some way. It affects others in some way. And in the large sample limit, the way that it affects others is actually like a pretty predictable. Like you need to understand how like my being treated affects my production, and then how that pushes forward in a large market is very different. So then you can just think of this is like asymptotically this is going to look like an average of per person influences. It's just that each person's influence also has this push forward effect on others. So cluster randomization should be both. This thing here, this kind of falls from estimating one direct effect and two elasticities. It turns out the noise in the direct effect is negligible. So you're essentially just taking the ratio of this and this, where this is, so it ends up being a ratio of two covariances. When you do this, actually the interference ends up being lower order, so it doesn't affect the precision. So you can essentially think this is like running two stage squares with an instrument that's of that scale.
Yeah.
And again, intuitions for cluster randomization.
And is the variance estimation based on variance estimation, or is like something very good?
Sorry.
The name is variance estimation, when there's one variance, it's kind of like good variance, but it's based in a variance is that much different, or it's kind of based on that?
So here all our asymptotic results end up being in this population sampling model. So the variance estimation would look like trying to estimate the population ATE under an IID sample. So it's simpler in that sense. But for the The challenge is that for the average indirect effect, this thing actually depends on, right, the effect of the treatment on myself, and this kind of like push forward. How did my treatment affect others? The problem is getting this push forward thing is actually really subtle, because like, think about methods like the bootstrap. If you bootstrap the data set, if you bring me from the data set, you remove my treatment and the effect of my treatment on my own outcome. So you're totally fine. But the bootstrap won't actually capture the like push forward effect, because if you remove me from the data set, what you need to do is you need to re-equilibrate prices, and the rest of you kind of figure out what to do without me in the room. But that's not going to happen in resampling methods. So you can't get the sigma d out of classical methods. You can't do a bootstrap or something like that. What you actually have to do is you need to estimate the push forward. So you need to estimate price elasticity, average price elasticity. So yeah, that's something I swept under the rug. But getting this sigma d here, you can't get it out of this trial. You need to estimating it as roughly as hard as estimate average indirect. So you need to rely on price manipulations and then use a plugin. So that is a challenge, right? Like again, if you have an estimator like this, you just have a difference in mean unit of the price manipulations in there. You can know it's an unbiased asymptotically normal estimated with ADE, but giving confidence intervals actually requires you getting elasticities from somewhere else.
All right, well, let's thank him again.